Imagine this. A perfectly ordinary day. A commercial flight. A seat that has been legally paid for. But when you board the plane, someone else is already sitting in your seat. And instead of apologizing, they look at you as if you're the one who doesn't belong there. The flight attendant hesitated. The eyes around them fell silent. And in those brief moments, you had to make a choice. Should you stay silent to keep things peaceful, or should you stand up knowing that it might make you a troublemaker? If it were you, what would you do when the entire system seems to be waiting for you to compromise? What nobody knew at the time was the black woman standing silently in the economy class cabin was the CEO of the company that operated the safety system and had the authority to halt an entire flight. But this story isn't about power. It's about dignity. About the moment when each of us must ask ourselves, if I remain silent today, what will become normal tomorrow? If you've ever felt like you had to compromise just to have peace, this story is for you. Please like, share, and subscribe to our channel to join us on this journey. A very real, very human story, and perhaps very much like your own. No one on flight AC-781 that day understood why everything suddenly stopped. The Boeing 787 had taxied nearly half a mile down the south runway of Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport, Atlanta. The engines roared steadily. The familiar pressure gently pressed against the backs of the seats. Some passengers had already begun closing their eyes, as if their bodies were automatically entering a flying state even before the wheels left the ground. Then, a very slight jolt, not strong, not violent, but enough to make someone in seat 22 look up. The sound of the engine gradually slowed down. The roar turned into a heavy, low growl. Then it fell silent. The plane came to a halt in the middle of the runway. There was no shouting, only silence spread like a wave. After a few seconds, the lights in the compartment flickered briefly. Then they stabilized. The air conditioning was still running, but the air seemed thicker. A child in the back began to cry softly. A man took off his headphones, looked around, confused. The captain's voice rang out, trying to remain calm. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Michael Turner from the cockpit. We have just received an abnormal technical alert from the air traffic control system. For safety reasons, we will be pausing our takeoff briefly to conduct an inspection. A moment. Those who fly frequently know this. A moment on a plane rarely lasts just a few minutes." In first class, a middle-aged white man shook his head in annoyance. He glanced down at the Rolex watch on his wrist, exhaled heavily through his nose, and then pressed the call button for the flight attendant. "What the hell is going on here?" His voice was anything but quiet. No one answered immediately. In economy class, row 34 seat B, a black woman sat upright, her hands resting neatly on her lap. She didn't look around. She wasn't using her phone. She didn't seem impatient. Looking out the small window, one could see the rain-soaked pavement reflecting the pale yellow light of the streetlights. If anyone paid attention, they would see that her face showed no surprise whatsoever. No one knew that just minutes before the woman herself had considered this possibility. No one knew that what happened on the runway didn't start in the cockpit, didn't start in the control tower, didn't start in the engine. It started with a chair, specifically seat 1A. 35 minutes earlier, at gate C-12, the atmosphere was completely different. Atlanta Airport on a weekend afternoon always resembles a microcosm of an overloaded city. Thousands of people, thousands of stories. Invisible clashes between fatigue, haste, and prejudice. The black woman was standing in line like everyone else. She was wearing a dark gray coat, dark jeans, and worn sneakers. On her shoulder was a plain, unbranded canvas bag. No one looked at her a second time. Her name is Avery Coleman. Avery didn't like arriving at the airport early. She preferred the feeling of being just in time. No rush, no excess, everything was just right. She had flown a lot over the past 15 years. Not because she enjoyed it, but because her job required it. She knew the smell of airports. She knew the distorted sound of the announcements. She knew how security personnel glanced at passengers for just 2 seconds to unconsciously categorize them into some kind of pattern. And she knew that today she was being misjudged. When Avery handed the phone to the ticket checker, the young woman glanced at the screen, then at Avery, then at the screen again. "Seat 1A," she asked as if the system had just made a joke. "Yes," Avery smiled slightly. She offered no further explanation. The ticket inspector said nothing. She returned the phone, but her gaze lingered on Avery's face longer than necessary. Avery was used to that. She stepped into the jet bridge where the cold white light made everyone look more tired than usual. The smell of metal, the smell of stale coffee, the smell of air conditioning. First class is much quieter. The leather seats are spacious. There's enough distance between them that you can't hear the person next to you breathing. Avery walked slowly, counting each row of seats. 1D, 1C, 1B, then she stopped. Seat 1A is occupied. A white man in his 50s, wearing a dark blue suit, with the top button undone, held a glass of whiskey. He was talking on the phone, laughing loudly, completely at ease, as if this place had been his all along. Avery stood still for a few seconds. She checked the ticket on her phone. No mistake. She cleared her throat very softly. "Excuse me, sir." The man held up a finger signaling to wait. He continued speaking into the phone for a few more sentences before looking up. His gaze swept over Avery from head to toe, his displeasure unconcealed. "What's the matter?" His voice was cold. "I think you're sitting in the wrong seat," Avery said slowly and clearly. "Seat 1A. The man laughed. Not a laugh of joy, rather the kind of laugh one hears when they think they've just heard a tasteless joke. "Are you sure?" He tilted his head. "The economy is behind us." Avery's expression remained unchanged. "I'm pretty sure," she said. "I have a ticket." A moment of silence. Then the man leaned back deeper in his chair and took a sip of whiskey. "Ma'am," he said, lowering his voice, "I'm a regular customer. I always sit in this seat. Perhaps the system made a mistake. You should check again." Avery stood there. No argument. No raising of voice. No one in first class spoke up. And from that moment, everything started to go off track. No one on flight AC 781 understood that a few dozen minutes later the aircraft worth over $200 million would be standing motionless on the runway, awaiting a decision not from the cockpit but from the very woman silently standing before seat 1A at that moment. The real story has only just begun. If anyone on flight AC 781 had really looked closely at the woman standing silently in front of seat 1A, at that time they would have noticed something very strange. She didn't tremble. She wasn't flustered. There was no defensive reflex which is typical of people who are cornered. Avery Coleman stood tall, shoulders relaxed, eyes calm. It wasn't resignation, nor was it pride. Rather, it was something deeper. The calmness of someone accustomed to being misjudged, and no longer feeling the need to prove anything immediately. Avery is 42 years old this year. At that age, most of the black women she knew had learned a very unique survival skill. They knew when to speak up, when to remain silent, and most importantly, they knew the price of each choice. Avery learned that from a very young age. She grew up in Decatur, Georgia, in a small house with a wooden porch that had faded with age. Her mother was a nurse. Her father used to be a maintenance worker at an aerospace parts factory on the outskirts of Atlanta. Not an engineer, not a manager, just someone who fixed things other people made. But every evening when he came home, Avery's father would tell her about airplanes. He wasn't talking about speed or altitude. He was talking about systems, about how an aircraft never depends on a single component. Everything has redundancies. There are procedures. There are safety limits. If a system only works when everyone is perfect, her father once said, then it's not a system. It's an accident waiting to happen. Those words stayed with Avery for a long time. She was good at math, good at logic. But Avery wasn't the loud, boisterous genius type. She didn't show off her grades. She didn't hog the spotlight. She preferred sitting in the middle row of class, listening more than she spoke. In college, Avery chose computer science, a decision that surprised many around her. At the time, very few black women pursued this field. Even fewer were persistent enough to stay. Avery used to be the only one in the boardroom, the only one who was different. The only one who was asked questions that her white colleagues had never had to answer. "Are you sure you understand this algorithm? Do you have anyone to help you? Where did you learn all this?" Avery answered at first. Then, she stopped answering. She learned to let her work speak for itself. 17 years later, Avery Coleman is the CEO and co-founder of Helix Aerosystems, a technology company that develops flight safety monitoring and coordination software for major airlines in the United States. Her company doesn't get much media attention. Helix Aero doesn't do flashy things. No trendy AI. no catchy slogans. They do something that very few people notice until it stops working. Helix Aero's system works in the background, silently, quietly, but it connects the most critical layers of data. From maintenance schedules and safety checks to the technical authorization needed for a flight to take off under special conditions. Avery never liked talking about it with strangers. She didn't like to flaunt her power, not out of feigned humility, but because she understood one thing clearly: true power doesn't need to be announced. It manifests itself when things stand still. Today, Avery flew to San Francisco to attend a meeting with the Federal Aviation Technology Oversight Committee. It was a tense meeting full of difficult questions and scrutinizing eyes. She had deliberated for a long time before deciding to fly this commercial flight instead of her company's private jet. It's not about saving money. It's about principles. Avery believed that if she wanted to build a system that served millions of passengers, she needed to sit with them, experience things like they did, and endure the inconveniences they faced. For Avery, Seat 1A today wasn't a privilege. It was simply a sensible choice after a tiring week of work. A quiet space to recharge mentally. And now that very seat has become the focal point of all prejudice. The man sitting opposite her continued to look at Avery with a mixture of disdain and annoyance. He didn't see a CEO. He only saw an ordinary-looking black woman slowing down her day. Avery felt that gaze. She had felt it 1,000 times in her life. But the difference is, this time she didn't feel hurt. She felt tired. Tired of repeating the same old script. Tired of knowing that even if she revealed her identity now, it wouldn't really change the fundamental nature of the problem. The question isn't who Avery is. It's why she needs to be someone to be treated kindly. A flight attendant approached. Laura Mitchell, in her 30s, had a professional smile and a voice trained to be just soft enough. "Is there anything I can help you with, sir?" The man spoke first. "Yes," he said. There was a slight misunderstanding. She thought this was her seat. Laura turned to Avery, her gaze quick and scrutinizing. 1 second. 2 seconds. Then, she looked back at the man. "Excuse me, ma'am," Laura said. "Could you show me the ticket?" Avery held out her phone. The screen lit up. Seat 1A. Clear. Laura looked. She nodded slightly. But she didn't say anything right away. There was a very brief moment when Avery saw hesitation in the flight attendant's eyes. It was a moment of choice. Not between right and wrong, but between risk and professional safety. And Avery knew which option usually won. "Let me double-check," Laura said, her voice slightly altered. Avery nodded. She stepped back half a pace. No argument, no pressure. In that moment, Avery thought of his father, of the airplanes, of the systems, of how humans are often the weakest link in any process. And she wondered very softly, what will I do if this system fails again? That question doesn't have an immediate answer, but it will be available soon. Airports are places where people believe everyone is equal. One ticket per person, one seat per person, one destination per person. But Avery Coleman knows better than that. She had been through enough airports to understand that in crowded spaces like these, people don't see each other as complete individuals. They see each other reflexively, through invisible labels, through stories they construct in their minds from just a few seconds of observation. At Hartsfield, Jackson, Atlanta, everything is always moving fast. The sound of suitcase wheels rolling on the stone floor, the announcements over the loudspeakers, the whining of children, the voices of adults arguing about layover times. And amidst all those sounds, there was something else. Silence. It was the silence of the eyes that glanced over Avery without stopping, or stopping for too long. Before even entering first class, Avery was already familiar with the feeling. She was used to being stared at as if she were in the wrong place. Used to the questions asked in a polite but suspicious tone. At security, an officer once held Avery longer than necessary. He didn't say why. He just checked her again, and then again. Avery didn't react. She knew if she did, the story would take a different turn. She didn't want to become the black woman who causes trouble. It was an invisible trap that Avery had long since learned to avoid. In first class, as Avery stood before seat 1A, she sensed a change in the atmosphere. Not noisy, but heavy. The other passengers in the cabin pretended not to hear. A man in seat 2C looked down at his newspaper. A woman in seat 3A adjusted her headphones. Nobody wanted to get involved. Avery doesn't blame them. She understood that self-protective mechanism. She used to be an outsider before she was in a position to enter the meeting room. Flight attendant Laura Mitchell returned after a few minutes. Her smile was still there, but her voice was a little stiffer. "Ma'am," Laura said to Avery, "the system indicates that a booking error may have occurred. This seat is currently occupied." Avery looked at Laura. Her gaze wasn't harsh, just tired. "I understand," Avery said, "but my ticket says 1A." Laura pursed her lips. She glanced at the white man, sipping whiskey, then back at Avery. The moment was fleeting, but Avery saw it clearly. This wasn't a data-checking moment. This was a power-balancing moment. The man smiled slightly and set the glass down. "Ma'am," he said, his voice tinged with annoyance, "we all want this flight to depart on time. I fly this route every week. Perhaps you should let them handle it." Avery felt her heart rate quicken slightly. Not from fear, but from familiarity. She had heard that phrase in other contexts. Let them handle it. Don't complicate things. It's a small matter. Those kinds of statements always come up when the speaker isn't the one who's been wronged. Avery took a deep breath. She didn't want to argue. Not now. Not here. "So what's your plan?" Avery asked Laura, his voice even. Laura hesitated. Then she spoke, as if reading from a familiar script. "We can arrange a seat for you in economy class. The row near the exit. There's extra legroom." Avery nodded slowly. Economy class. A few other passengers started to pay attention. Some tilted their heads. Others glanced quickly and then looked away. No one spoke up. Avery didn't blame them. She understood that in this environment, speaking up was also a risk, and not everyone was willing to pay the price for the justice of others. She turned back to look at seat 1 one last time. Not out of regret, but because she realized this was no longer just a story about the seat. This is a story about who is trusted, who gets priority, and who is asked to be flexible. Avery bent down and picked up her cloth bag. The movement was slow, deliberate, not to draw attention, but to keep herself from reacting emotionally. She walked toward the back of the plane past the curtain separating first class from economy. The moment Avery stepped through that curtain, she felt a distinct change. The air was noisier, the seats were narrower, people were closer together, and the look was completely different. An elderly woman stepped aside to let Avery pass. A young boy looked at her curiously. A man nodded slightly as a silent greeting. In this compartment, Avery wasn't in the wrong place. She blended in with the crowd. Following Laura's directions, she found seat 34B, a middle seat, not ideal. But Avery didn't complain. She sat down, fastened her seatbelt, placed her bag under the seat in front of her. In that moment, Avery felt a wave of emotion wash over her. Not violent, not explosive, but heavy. She thought back to all the previous times. The time she chose silence to keep the peace. The time she told herself that some battles weren't worth fighting. And she wondered, would this time be like the previous times? She looked out the window. The runway reflected the gray sky. Another plane was taxiing in the distance. Avery remembered his father's words. If a system only works when everyone is perfect, then it's not a system. This system is not perfect. And Avery knew she was in a very special position to realize that. She didn't take out her phone right away. She didn't open her laptop. She just sat there, observing, listening. The sound of a flight attendant closing the overhead compartments. The announcement of safety information over the loudspeaker. The sound of a man in front complaining about the legroom. Everything looked normal. Too normal. But beneath that apparent normalcy, Avery sensed a tiny crack. A discrepancy. Something most people would overlook. She placed her hand on the cloth bag where the slim laptop lay. And, for the first time since boarding the plane, Avery Coleman asked herself a question she had always avoided. If I do nothing, how many more times will this happen? That question doesn't have an immediate answer, but it has started to change things. Economy class gradually settled down as passengers took their seats. The familiar sounds of seatbelts being fastened, overhead compartments closing, and safety reminders echoed steadily. Outside, a light drizzle fell thin as a fine mist covering the runway. Avery Coleman sat still in seat 34B. She didn't move much. She didn't sigh. She didn't lean her head against the seat in front of her. She maintained an upright posture, as if waiting for something or reminding herself to be patient. But that peace didn't last. From the front of the compartment through the partition curtain, the voice of the white man rang out clearer and more irritating than before. "Are you sure you're all right?" His voice betrayed no concern. "Are we going to be late because of this silly stuff?" A few passengers in economy class looked up. Some frowned. Others shook their heads, as if they had anticipated this scenario. Avery didn't turn around. She knew the voice. No need to look. Flight attendant Laura Mitchell hurried down the aisle, trying to keep her voice as low as possible. "Sir, please keep your voice down. We are handling this. Deal with it." The man chuckled dryly. "I just want to sit in my seat and fly on time." Avery closed her eyes for a moment. Not to avoid it, but to keep herself from reacting instinctively. She's reacted that way before. The results were never better. As Laura returned to the economy class compartment for a final check, her eyes met Avery's. For a brief moment, Avery saw something different in that gaze, a flicker of confusion mixed with defensiveness. "Ma'am," Laura said softly, leaning closer to Avery than necessary. "I apologize for the inconvenience. We will try to depart as soon as possible." Avery nodded. "I understand," she replied. "Go ahead and do your work." That answer made Laura pause for half a second. She seemed to have prepared for a different reaction, a complaint, a reproachful look, a sharp question. But Avery wouldn't give her that. The plane vibrated slightly as the engines began to start. A few passengers breathed a sigh of relief. Some had their phones ready to text takeoff imminent. In first class, the man in seat 1, a lean-back, further-looking content. He turned to the person next to him and said half-jokingly, half-seriously, "See, finally everything is back to normal." Normal. Avery opened her eyes. She looked straight ahead, where a small screen was playing a safety instruction video. The flight attendants smiled brightly, demonstrating how to fasten seatbelts and use oxygen masks. Everything seemed to be going smoothly. Everything was on track, everything was according to plan. But Avery knew there were things that didn't show up on the screen. As the plane began to taxi, Avery placed her hand in the cloth bag. The cool feel of the metal laptop casing touched her fingertips. She didn't open it immediately. She just left her hand there. As a silent reminder, she thought about seat 1A, not because it's bigger, not because it's quieter, but because of what it represents. A seat was paid for, a legitimate right, and a boundary was crossed, simply because someone else believed they had the right. Avery wondered if she wasn't the one sitting in that chair today who would be next. Another woman, another person of color, someone dressed inappropriately. The system doesn't register such small discrepancies. But humans do. The plane gradually increased speed. The pressure on the seat backs became more noticeable. Some passengers gripped the armrest tightly. Then, a strange sound. Not large, not sharp, but noticeable enough for Avery to recognize. A short beep sound came from somewhere ahead, near the cockpit, not a sound we usually hear at this stage. Avery opened her eyes and focused. She tilted her head slightly, as if listening to a familiar piece of music. A second beep sounded. Then a third. In the cockpit, Captain Michael Turner frowned. He glanced at the control panel, then at the co-pilot. A yellow warning light was flashing. "What's going on?" the co-pilot asked. Michael didn't answer immediately. He quickly read the information displayed. "We just lost authentication from the security monitoring system," he said. "Not serious, but it's ill-timed." The co-pilot glanced quickly at the airspeed indicator. "Should we stop?" Michael hesitated. Very briefly, but long enough for the decision to become difficult. "Yes," he said. "Safety first. Nobody in the cabin knows that. Not yet." Avery could sense the change in the aircraft's movement pattern even before it came to a complete stop. She was familiar with these signals. These were subtle deviations that only someone with years of experience working with the systems would notice. As the plane's wheels began to decelerate, a few passengers looked up, bewildered. "What's going on?" someone whispered. Avery remained seated. She didn't look around. She showed no surprise. The plane came to a complete stop. The silence spread thick and heavy. In first class, the man in seat 1A exclaimed, "What the hell?" His voice was cut off when the captain's voice came through the loudspeaker. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing a minor technical issue related to our security authentication system. For the sake of absolute safety, we will be temporarily aborting takeoff for inspection." A few sighs could be heard, a few murmurs. In seat 34, Avery Coleman finally took his hand out of his cloth bag. She didn't smile. She didn't sigh with relief. She didn't feel victorious. There's only one very familiar feeling, the feeling when a system no longer works the way it was advertised. And in that moment, Avery knew seat 1A is no longer the central focus of the story. The new system is what's being questioned. When Captain Michael Turner's voice faded from the loudspeaker, the cabin fell into a strange state. Not panic, not explosive anger. Rather, a tightly compressed silence, like a room full of people simultaneously trying to figure out what had just happened. The Boeing 787 stood still in the middle of the runway, like a giant creature that had just had someone place a hand on its shoulder and signal it to stop. In first class, the man in seat 1 suddenly sat up. The whiskey glass in his hand tilted slightly, a few drops spilling onto the small table. "Unbelievable," he exclaimed without directing his words at anyone in particular. "The entire flight is grounded because of a ridiculous mistake." Several other passengers glanced over. Some frowned. Others turned away, not wanting to get involved. In economy class, Avery Coleman remained seated. She heard the voice clearly, but she didn't turn. She was used to voices like that, always trying to take up space. Another flight attendant hurried down the aisle. Daniel Reyes, tall and with a tense expression, bent down and whispered something to Laura Mitchell near the partition curtain. "The captain wants a detailed report," Daniel said. "The security authentication system isn't responding as usual." Laura nodded, but her eyes darted toward the first-class section, where the man in seat 1A was clearly beginning to lose his patience. "Can you explain that more clearly?" he called out, his voice laced with frustration. "I have an important meeting in San Francisco." Laura approached him, keeping her voice low enough. "Sir, we are doing everything we can. Please have a seat." "I've sat here long enough," he interrupted. "We're being held back by an avoidable mistake." That statement was like a needle. It wasn't just aimed at the system. It was aimed at the people. And then his gaze swept across the curtain toward the economy class section. Towards Avery. "Where is she?" he said, his voice low but loud enough for those around him to hear. "She's the one who caused this, isn't she?" No one answered immediately. A few passengers turned their heads to look behind them. Curious glances. Inquisitive glances. Gazes wanting to understand what was happening. Avery felt those gazes run down her spine like a wave, not out of embarrassment, but out of familiarity. She had been the center of such stares before. In the boardroom, in the classroom, in spaces where she was considered an exception. Laura turned to the economy class section. Her gaze lingered on Avery longer than usual. "Ma'am," Laura said, her voice still polite but having lost its initial softness, "could you please stand up for a moment?" A few murmurs arose. Not loud, but enough to create a small wave of sound. Avery lifted her head. She looked at Laura. Not angry, not defiant. "What's wrong?" Avery asked, her voice calm. "We need to double-check some information," Laura replied. "To make sure everything is done correctly. The procedure was followed correctly." Avery took a deep breath. She stood up slowly, not because she was forced, but because she knew that if she refused, the conversation would immediately take a different turn. She stepped out into the aisle and stood between the two rows of seats. Suddenly, the space around her seemed to expand, even though the economy class was actually quite cramped. The man in seat 1 squinted, watching Avery from a distance through the curtain. "See," he said to the person sitting next to him without lowering his voice. "Things always get complicated when the system tries to appear fair." That remark made a few people frown, but no one said anything. Avery stood there listening to every word. She felt something well up in her chest. Not an outburst of anger, but a deep weariness. Tired of having to be present. Tired of having to be validated. Tired of having to prove I'm not wrong, while others don't need to prove the opposite. Daniel Reyes approached, carrying a small tablet device. He glanced at Avery, then at Laura. "What are we doing?" Daniel whispered. "The problem is with the system, not the passengers." Laura pursed her lips. She looked toward the first-class compartment. Then she looked back at Avery. "We just need to be sure," Laura said, "to avoid complaints." Complaint. Avery heard the word and briefly closed her eyes. She knew exactly who people usually thought of when they heard the word complaint. That's not the person standing in front of them. Avery opened her eyes. She looked at Daniel. "I'm willing to cooperate," Avery said. but I want to know why I'm being investigated. Daniel hesitated. He looked at Laura. Then he looked at the device in his hand. Just confirming the ticket information, he replied, his voice uncertain. Avery nodded. Please check, she said. My ticket is for seat 1A. The words rang out clearly. Not loudly, but they carried enough weight. Several passengers looked up. Some looked at Avery differently. Some began to feel uncomfortable with the situation. Daniel looked at the device. The screen lit up. He read. Then, he read it again. He lifted his head, his expression changing. Your ticket. It's indeed 1A, he said slowly. The surrounding space seemed to freeze. Laura froze. The man in seat 1A chuckled, but this time the laughter was less confident. So what he said, this happens all the time. The system sometimes makes mistakes. Avery looked directly at him. This was the first time she had deliberately looked at him. So, why, Avery asked, her voice still calm, wasn't this checked from the beginning? No one answered immediately. Laura took a deep breath. She turned to Avery, lowering her voice. Ma'am, we'll handle it after we get back to the gate. After returning to the gate, Avery understood. It meant things would drag on, be blurred, be put into a process where small decisions would dissolve. She nodded. Okay, Avery said. But I won't sit down until this is recorded. A few passengers around widened their eyes. Not because of the words, but because of the way they were said. No anger, no threats, just a boundary being set. In first class, the man in seat 1 lightly tapped his hand on the table. How ridiculous, he muttered. Just for a seat. Avery heard, and this time she answered. Not loudly, but clearly enough. No, Avery said. Because of the way we treat each other. The words hung suspended in the space between the two compartments. No one applauded, no one objected, but something has changed. The public humiliation was no longer just Avery's. It had become a shared question, an uncomfortable feeling that no one in the compartment could deny. And as the plane began to taxi back to the gate, Avery Coleman knew that whatever happened next, she wouldn't let this moment slip away as a small mistake. The plane taxied slowly back towards the gate. There were no loud complaints. No one stood up, only scattered sighs like small waves crashing against the hull of the ship and then disappearing. Avery Coleman sat back in seat 34B, as requested by the flight attendant. She didn't argue, not because she was weak, but because she knew that at this moment every move she made would be scrutinized. The economy class cabin became quieter than before. Those who had been curious now turned back to the screens in front of them. The safety video played again from the beginning, as if nothing unusual had just happened. But Avery knew things were different now. She placed both hands on her thighs, overlapping them. Her left hand trembled slightly, very subtly, a sign that very few people would notice, a sign of accumulated fatigue. I'm not tired from arguing. I'm tired from having to be present. She looked down at the floor where her old sneakers lightly touched the airplane carpet. Those shoes had accompanied her through many airports, many meetings. Many times she chose simplicity over ostentation. There were days when Avery wondered if this simplicity was the right choice, or just another way to make herself more misunderstood in the eyes of others. She thought of her father's words, but this time the memory didn't offer immediate strength. It carried an unsettling question. If I always have to prove myself, when will it ever be enough? A voice boomed through the cockpit. Captain Michael Turner's voice was calm, but there was something heavier about it. Ladies and gentlemen, we have returned to the gate to conduct a thorough check of the security authentication system. This process may take some time. Please remain seated. Several passengers sighed. A man in seat 36 shook his head and whispered to the person next to him. A woman opened her phone and began texting to report a delay. Avery did nothing. She didn't take out her phone. She didn't text her assistant. She didn't email the team. She knew that if she did, her mind would be pulled away from this moment, and she needed to stay in it. At this lowest point, she looked around. Economy class wasn't pretty. It wasn't comfortable, but it was real. The people here didn't pretend to be polite. They breathed. They were tired. They were annoyed. They lived. An elderly woman sitting in seat 34C turned to Avery. She had short gray hair and thin but warm hands. Are you all right? She asked, her voice low, neither curious nor sympathetic. Avery looked up. She smiled faintly. a tired but genuine smile. "I'm fine," Avery replied. "Just a little tired." The woman nodded, as if she understood perfectly what the word tired implied. "You know," she said, "people always think fatigue comes from overwork. But often fatigue comes from suffering." Avery said nothing. She just nodded. That remark touched a very deep nerve. Suffer. Avery had endured for years. Not direct blows, but small scratches, gazes, questions, assumptions. These aren't big enough to warrant litigation, but they're enough to wear you down. She thought of Helix Aerosystems, of her team of engineers, diverse, talented people who believed in her vision. She thought of the meeting in San Francisco, the serious faces, the sharp questions. She thought about the gossip that would arise if she didn't arrive on time today. Maybe she's not stable enough. Maybe she's overreacting. Those words are always ready and waiting. Avery felt a heavy weight in her chest. Not panic, rather a very quiet sadness. She wondered in that moment, standing before seat 1, whether she should have revealed her identity from the beginning. Perhaps things would have been different. Perhaps the flight would have taken off on time. But then she remembered. If she has to use business cards to earn respect, what does that respect mean? The first-class doors opened. Laura Mitchell stepped down into economy class, her eyes avoiding his gaze. She paused near Avery. "Ma'am," Laura said softly, "we're coordinating with the technical department. It might take some time." Avery looked at Laura. No reproach. No anger. "I understand," she said. "Go ahead and do your work." That answer confused Laura. She nodded quickly and walked away as if she needed to escape the conversation. Avery watched her. She didn't see Laura as a bad person. She saw in her a familiar fear. Fear of making a mistake. Fear of losing her job. Fear of siding with the wrong people. Fear is also a system. Avery leaned back in her chair. She closed her eyes. This time, she allowed herself to fully feel the exhaustion. Not to surrender, but to acknowledge, admittedly, no matter how strong she is, she's still human. She still has limits. There are still moments when she wants to let go and just let things go. She recalled the first time an investor told her straight to her face, "You're very talented, but not safe enough to be the face of the brand." She nodded, smiled, and then went home and sat in her car for a long time before getting out. She recalled nights spent coding until 2 in the morning, wondering if anyone would have believed in her vision if she weren't the person she was. Those memories didn't weaken Avery. They only reminded her that this path had never been easy. The plane remained stationary. Time seemed to slow down. In first class, the man in seat 1A was still complaining. His voice was audible, distant but clear. "What a waste of time," he said. "All for such a small matter." Avery opened her eyes. This time she wasn't angry. She saw things clearly. Clearly, if she did nothing, this story would be recorded as a technical incident, a single report, a generic apology email. And tomorrow, on another flight, someone else will stand in front of their seat, hearing the same words. Avery placed his hand in the fabric pocket. The familiar solid feel of the laptop. Like a support, she didn't open it right away. But this time, the question in her mind was no longer should I or shouldn't I. It's more about how. Avery Coleman didn't open his laptop right away. She rested her hands on the canvas bag, feeling the very slight vibrations of the aircraft beneath her feet. Those vibrations usually gave her a familiar sensation and a large, steady heartbeat. But this time that heartbeat was interrupted, fluctuating, unstable. She closed her eyes not to escape but to listen. It's not the sounds around you. It's the debate taking place within yourself. "Don't overdo it," an old voice spoke up. The voice of experience. Of the time she chose the least risky path. "They'll say she's overreacting," that voice continued. "They always say that." Avery took a deep breath. She knew this voice very well. It had helped her survive. It had helped her get through cold boardrooms, presentations where every eye was scrutinizing her. But another voice, deeper and slower, also began to speak. "And what if I remain silent?" the voice asked. "Who will bear the consequences?" Avery opened her eyes. The economy class was the same. The elderly woman in seat 34C was knitting a scarf. A man in front of her was tapping his fingers on his knee restlessly. A flight attendant walked by carrying a tray of drinks. Life goes on. Despite the injustice that just occurred, Avery thought of the word boundary. She set boundaries her whole life, boundaries in her work, in her relationships, in how she allowed others to treat her. But today, that boundary has been crossed not with a powerful blow, but with a subtle disregard enough for anyone to pretend not to notice. She thought of Helix Aerosystems. She thought of the long nights spent with the team building layer after layer of authentication, layer after layer of redundancy. She thought of how she had always emphasized that a good system must be able to detect errors early before consequences occur. So why, when something goes wrong with people, Avery wondered, do we call it a minor issue? An internal announcement echoed through the cabin. Laura Mitchell walked past and whispered something to Daniel Reyes. Avery couldn't hear clearly, but she saw Daniel shake his head, his face tense. The system is still not stable. Avery leaned her head back gently in her chair. She let her memories guide her back to another time many years ago in a small conference room in Oakland. At that time, Helix Aero was still a fledgling company. An investor asked her very directly, if your system detects a serious error right before takeoff, would you dare to stop the flight even if it cost the airline millions? Avery answered without hesitation. If my system didn't stop the flight, she said, then I was wrong from the start. The room fell silent. Not everyone liked that answer, but they had signed the contract. Because safety is not something to compromise on. Avery opened her eyes. She stared straight ahead. The internal conflict became clearer. It was no longer a question of should I or shouldn't I. Rather, it's about how we will take responsibility. She knew that if she intervened, things wouldn't be so simple. There would be reports. There would be investigations. There would be people questioning her motives. They might say she used her personal power. They might say she influenced hundreds of people. But Avery also knew another truth: the system didn't just randomly report errors. It reacted to what was input into it. An authentication process was skipped, a procedure was bent, a decision was made for convenience. And if she turns a blind eye, she will be complicit. The man in seat 1 spoke up again, this time louder and more impatient. When will it be finished? He said. We can't just sit here forever. Avery heard it, and this time she didn't feel tired anymore. She saw it clearly. Clearly, this isn't about the man. It's not just about the chair. It's about a recurring pattern where one person's convenience is prioritized over another's dignity. Avery took her hand out of her cloth bag and placed it on the small table in front of her. She didn't open her laptop. Not yet. She took out her phone, a secure device with no social media apps and no unnecessary notifications. She opened an app with a very simple interface, just a few status updates and a verification icon, Helix Aero's internal application. Avery paused. Her finger hovered above the screen. This is the moment when the old voice speaks again, when everyone will look at her and ask why. Avery closed her eyes for a second. She thought of the elderly woman beside her. She thought of the boy who had looked at her curiously as she entered the compartment. She thought of those who had no choice, no voice. She opened her eyes. Because the system requires it, she whispered as if talking to herself. Avery didn't press anything. Not yet. She needed to be sure. Not about the technique, she was already sure about that. But about herself. She wondered if this action stemmed from anger at being hurt or from a deeper principle. She reviewed each emotion within her. The anger had subsided. The weariness remained, but it no longer dominated. What remained was a clear calmness, the kind of calm that comes when a decision has been made. Avery remembered her mother. She remembered how her mother always said, "You don't need to raise your voice to tell the truth. You just need to stand firm." She stands firm even when sitting. An internal message appeared on the app. From Evan Brooks, technical director of Helix Aero. We have found a slight discrepancy in the authentication of flight AC-781 compared to the standard. We are monitoring it. Would you like us to intervene? Avery stared at the words for a long time. This is no longer a hypothetical question. The system has spoken. The team has seen it. Responsibility has materialized. Avery typed slowly. Not yet. I need further confirmation. Evan replied almost immediately. Understood. Avery put down the phone. She leaned back in her chair. The space around her seemed quieter, not because things were all right, but because she was all right inside. The debate is over. Not through a shout, but through an inner consensus. Avery knew the hardest part wasn't pressing the button. It was accepting what would come next. She looked out the window. The rain had stopped. The wet runway reflected the lights, creating long, sparkling streaks. A system can withstand pressure. So can a human being. The question is, when does pressure become a dangerous silence? Avery Coleman placed her hand on the table. Her fingers were no longer hovering in the air. She's ready. Avery Coleman didn't look around when he opened his laptop. She knew that every glance could become a different story. And she didn't want this story to begin with the attention-grabbing movement. She only turned on the device just enough for the screen to light up in her lap, obscured by the back of the seat in front of her. The slim laptop emitted a very soft fan hum. A familiar sound, like the breathing of a creature that had been her companion for many years. Avery placed her hands on the keyboard. She didn't type immediately. She waited. In economy class, time seemed to drag on longer than usual. Those who had finished texting put away their phones. Those who hadn't started to get restless. A flight attendant pushed a water cart past, handing out small cups of water as a calming ritual. In first class, the man in seat 1A was still complaining. This time he spoke to Laura Mitchell, his voice no longer maintaining its feigned politeness. "I need a clear explanation," he said. "We can't just wait indefinitely." Laura nodded, her lips pressed together. She said something reassuring, but Avery didn't hear clearly. She didn't need to hear. She had heard enough. Avery looked at the screen. The Helix Aero Core interface appeared simple, almost sterile. No superfluous colors. No flashy graphs. Just lines of status, each representing a validation layer. Flight AC-781 appears in the top left corner of the screen. Next to it is a faint yellow icona low-altitude warning. Avery frowned. Just as Evan said, she thought. A slight discrepancy. But Avery knew that small in the context of safety systems is never insignificant. She opened the Details tab. The data appeared in layers, weather conditions, maintenance schedule, personnel verification, and one line made her stop. Override manual priority adjustment. Pending review. Avery exhaled very slowly. Adjust priorities manually. She debated this feature extensively during the early years of Helix Aero's development. It was designed to handle genuine emergencies, medical, national security, or situations where time is of the essence. Not for convenience. Avery opened the logs. The name of the person who performed the override appeared. It wasn't the pilot. It wasn't the control tower. A mid-level airline dispatcher. Someone Avery had never met, but she had seen this type of decision before. She wasn't angry. Not surprised. It's just a familiar feeling when the process is slightly bent to make things flow more smoothly. Avery placed both hands on the keyboard. Her fingers paused on the enter key. Just one action, she thought. A very small action. If she confirms the procedure, the system will request additional checks. Not dangerous, but enough to halt the flight until everything is done correctly. No accidents, no drama, just accountability. Avery glanced around. The elderly woman in seat 34C was resting with her eyes closed. A flight attendant stood at the back of the cabin, speaking softly into her intercom. No one paid any attention to her, just as Avery wanted. She opened the internal chat window. Evan Brooks' message was still there. Avery typed, "The confirmation override is out of context. I request that an additional level 2 standard check be triggered." Evan replied almost immediately. "Received. Activate now." Avery paused for a moment. This was the moment when all the ethical questions converged. She wondered if she was doing this out of humiliation or because the system was being abused. She checked her emotions. The anger was gone. Only clarity remained. "Yes," Avery typed. "Activate," Evan replied. "Activated. Notification will be sent to the cockpit and safety department." Avery closed her laptop. She didn't look at the screen again. She put the device back into the cloth bag, zipping it up gently. No one noticed. No one knew. In the cockpit, a familiar sound echoed. Not an emergency siren, but a new series of authentication announcements. Captain Michael Turner glanced at the control panel. The gold icon turned orange. "What's going on?" the co-pilot asked. Michael quickly read the information. "The system just requested additional checks due to an improper override," he said. "We are not permitted to take off until that is complete." The co-pilot exhaled. "Just more time." Michael nodded. But his expression wasn't one of annoyance. He'd flown long enough to understand one thing: the system didn't naturally demand more. "Call ground safety," Michael said. "We're following the correct procedure." In first class, the man in seat 1 Slammed his hand down on the table. Unbelievable, he exclaimed. We're being held back by some meaningless paperwork. A few passengers turned to look. No one answered. In economy class, Avery sensed the change in the air even before the announcement was made. A very distinct slowdown, as if the entire plane were holding its breath. Captain Michael's voice rang out. Ladies and gentlemen, we have received a request for additional checks from the safety monitoring system. For absolute safety reasons, the flight will be temporarily suspended from takeoff. A wave of reaction spread. Sighs, murmurs, a few voices of protest. Avery closed her eyes, not out of fear, but because she knew that from this moment on the story had taken a turn from which there was no return. She thought of the word responsibility. It's not about power. It's not about revenge. It's about responsibility when you see wrongdoing and not turning a blind eye. The man in seat 1A stood up abruptly. This is ridiculous, he said. Do you know who I am? Laura Mitchell stepped forward, her voice firmer than before. Sir, please sit down, she said. This is a safety requirement. We cannot ignore it. System. That word echoed in Avery's head like a bell. The system has no face, no biases. It simply reacts to data and processes. And when it says stop, everyone is forced to listen. Avery opened her eyes. She looked out the window. The rain had stopped completely. A weak ray of sunlight pierced through the clouds, shining down on the wet runway. A moment of great peace. She didn't know what would happen next. She only knew she had done the right thing, according to the standards she had spent her life building. And sometimes doing the right thing doesn't bring immediate relief. Sometimes it simply brings the calm before the storm. No more pause, no more checking further. This time, the word that echoed through the airplane cabin was a very different word. Grounded. Captain Michael Turner's voice rang out again, slower, clearer, no longer using phrases to de-escalate the situation. Ladies and gentlemen, according to instructions from the Central Safety Monitoring System, Flight AC-781 is not yet fit for takeoff. We have been instructed to ground aircraft until Level 2 checks are completed. A wave of reaction spread throughout the compartment. No more whispering. No more silence. The sighs turned into complaints. The complaints escalated into loud questions. Some people stood up abruptly despite the flight attendant's request to remain seated. In first class, the man in seat 1A could no longer restrain himself. Unbelievable, he exclaimed. We're being held back by a ridiculous administrative decision. He turned to Laura Mitchell, his gaze intense. Do you know how much money I'll lose because of this? Laura took a deep breath. She no longer avoided his gaze as she had before. Sir, she said, her voice firmer, this is not our decision. This is a mandatory requirement from the safety system. Which system? He growled. Who is behind that system? That question echoed, hanging in the air above the first-class cabin. In economy class, Avery Coleman could hear very clearly. She didn't move. She didn't bow her head. She didn't flinch. She simply observed quietly how a single word the system could change the power dynamics so quickly. Another flight attendant stepped forward and said something into the intercom. Just a few minutes later, the cabin door opened. Two airport security officers stepped aboard, followed by a man in a gray suit, wearing a Federal Aviation Safety Liaison badge. The air in the cabin changed instantly. The complaints gradually subsided. People began to realize that this was no longer an ordinary incident. The man in the gray suit glanced around, his eyes quick and precise. He paused for a second in the first-class compartment, then turned back to Laura. We need to speak to the captain, he said briefly. Michael Turner stepped out of the cockpit. His face was calm, but his eyes were more serious than before. The system is sending a second-level check request, Michael said. There's an override out of context. The man in the gray suit nodded. We've seen it, he said, and we need to identify who is ultimately responsible. In first class, the man in seat 1 frowned. You're making a big deal out of this, he said. It's just a flight. The man in the gray suit turned around, his eyes cold. Sir, he said, there is no such thing as just a flight when it comes to safety. Some passengers began whispering. The name of the Federal Aviation Administration was mentioned. Phones were pulled out. A few people secretly recorded videos. In economy class, Avery sensed it. She knew this moment wouldn't remain confined to the airplane cabin any longer. Daniel Reyes walked closer to Avery. His voice was low. Madam, he said, you may be asked a few questions. Avery nodded. I'm ready, she replied. Daniel was slightly surprised. Not by the answer itself, but by the way it was said, calm, undefensive. The man in the gray suit walked down the aisle and stopped in front of Avery. "Are you Avery Coleman?" he asked. Avery stood up, slowly, without being asked. "Yes," she said. "We need to confirm some information regarding the Helix Aero system," he said. "Are you the person with final approval authority?" The airplane cabin was filled with a sense of dread. Some gazes shifted from curiosity to surprise. A few people began piecing together the disparate fragments of information. Avery didn't look around. She stared straight at the man in the gray suit. "Yes," she said. "I am the CEO of Helix Aerosystems." There was no loud murmuring, no dramatic gasps. It was just a thick, oppressive silence. In first class, the man in seat 1A stood motionless. The whiskey glass in his hand trembled slightly. "Wait a minute," he said, his voice lowering. "What did you say?" Avery turned around. This was the second time that day she had looked directly at him. "I am the CEO of Helix Aerosystems," she repeated, her voice even. "The company that operates the security authentication system being used for this flight." Several passengers gasped. A woman in seat 35 covered her mouth. A young man whispered, "Impossible." The man in the gray suit nodded. "Thank you," he said. "That confirms what we saw in the system logs." He turned to Michael Turner. "The flight will remain grounded until the inspection is complete. No exceptions." Michael nodded. "Understood." In first class, the man in seat 1A was trying to regain his voice. "Well then, could you help resolve this faster?" he said, his voice less harsh. "We both want to move on." Avery looked at him. Not angry, not gloating. "I can't," she said. "And I won't." The answer was clear and needed no further explanation. "Safety is not something to be negotiated," Avery continued, "and procedures don't exist to serve the convenience of an individual." The man in seat 1A said nothing more. A few passengers began to clap. Not in unison, not loudly, but enough to create a small wave. Avery felt something very strange. Not victory, but a new kind of heaviness. She knew this moment wouldn't end here. There would be questions, there would be criticism, there would be people saying she abused her power. But she also knew that if she didn't stand firm today, the system she had built would become an empty shell. The man in the gray suit turned to Avery again. "She'll need to stay and work with us," he said. "It might take a few hours." Avery nodded. "I'm here," she said. The plane remained stationary on the runway. But inside something was moving. It's no longer about a chair. It's no longer a personal dispute. That was the moment when true power, the power of accountability, came to light. And Avery Coleman knew that from this moment on things would only get harder. After Avery Coleman revealed his identity, the airplane cabin fell into a very different kind of silence. The silence isn't because they don't know what to say. Rather, it's because each person is adjusting their perception of the other. Just seconds before, Avery was simply the woman in economy class. She had been asked to stand up, had her ticket checked, and was being treated as the cause of the delay. She is now the CEO of Helix Aerosystems, the woman behind the system that just brought a Boeing 787 worth hundreds of millions of dollars to a halt. That transformation didn't happen with a bang. It happened in silence. The man in seat 1A slumped over. His shoulders slumped. The flight attendant had already taken back his whiskey glass. His hands rested on his knees, trembling slightly though he tried to remain calm. "Nobody told me," he muttered, not addressing anyone in particular. Avery didn't react. She didn't seek his gaze. No apology was needed. No belated acknowledgement was required. She just stood there listening to her own breathing. The man in the gray suit, a representative of the Federal Aviation Safety Liaison, turned and whispered something to Daniel Reyes, then gestured to the two security officers stationed at the front and rear of the cabin. "We will follow standard procedures," he said. "No one will leave the plane until it's complete." Laura Mitchell stood nearby, her face paler than usual. She glanced at Avery, her gaze no longer defensive. Instead, it was a mixture of confusion and regret. "Mrs. Coleman," Laura said softly. I'm sorry." Avery turned around. Her gaze was neither reproachful nor cold. "I understand," she said. "You're just working within a pre-established system." That answer left Laura stunned. She nodded but said nothing more. There are apologies that when they come too late no longer have any soothing effect, only a reflective value. In the economy class, compartment whispers began to spread. Is she the CEO of an aviation safety technology company? Oh my God, they just made her stand up. Some gazes fell upon Avery with a newfound respect. Others held an undeniable sense of shame. Some turned away, as if trying to avoid the truth that they had remained silent when they could have spoken. Avery sensed it all, but she didn't let herself be swept away. She had once faced admiring glances. She had once faced skeptical glances, and she knew that neither was sustainable. The only thing that is truly enduring is principle. Captain Michael Turner stepped out of the cockpit, carrying a stack of electronic documents. He looked at Avery and nodded respectfully. "Thank you for confirming this," he said. "We will work with the safety team to complete the inspection." Avery nodded in response. "I'm willing to assist within the scope of the process," she said. Nothing more. Michael looked at her, understanding perfectly the meaning of those words. There were no shortcuts, no special privilege, and not even for the top of the system. A few passengers started clapping again. This time the sound was clearer, but Avery raised his hand, slightly signaling them to stop. "Please don't," she said softly. "This isn't a victory." The applause stopped. A few people awkwardly lowered their hands. Avery looked around the airplane cabin. She saw tired people held up in the middle of their journey. She saw the inconvenience her decision had caused, and she didn't shy away from it. "I understand that people are upset," Avery said without a loudspeaker, but his voice was clear enough, "and I take responsibility for the inconvenience. But safety isn't something we only care about when an accident happens." No one objected. No one argued. A young man in seat 36 stood up. "If the system says it needs checking," he said, "then I'd rather be late than take the risk." A few yes responses rang out. Not loudly, but sincerely. The man in seat 1A said nothing. He bowed his head, looking down at his gleaming leather shoes. For the first time all flight he looked smaller. Daniel Reyes walked over to Avery. "Ma'am," he said softly, "we will need your signature on the incident report." Avery nodded. She picked up the stylus and signed her name, Avery Coleman, in her familiar, steady handwriting. After signing, she suddenly realized something. This was the first time that day her name had been recorded before it came under suspicion. A strange feeling passed through me. No schadenfreude. No bitterness. Just a truth revealed too late. The man in the gray suit turned around again. "Miss Coleman," he said, "we will need to work with you and the Helix Aero team over the next few hours. The media may get involved." Avery nodded. "I was prepared for that," she replied. She knew that from this moment on the story would no longer be confined to the airplane cabin. It would go outside, online, in the newspapers, and be retold in many different ways. Some will call her a hero. Others will call her an abuser of power. Avery had no control over that. The only thing she could control was why she did it. She looked out the window. The sunlight was brighter. The runway was drying. The plane remained stationary, but the atmosphere in the cabin was less tense. A very fragile moment of transition. It's no longer about a chair. It's no longer about personal conflict. But the bigger question is hanging in the air within that confined space. When a system is built to protect everyone, will it be brave enough to show no favoritism? Avery Coleman knew that question would haunt her long after the plane door opened. The silence that followed the revelation of Avery Coleman's true identity did not last forever. It's just like the pause between two heartbeats, short, but enough to change everything. A man in seat 28 broke the silence. "Excuse me," he said, his voice not harsh but clear. "I just want to understand one thing. If you have the power to stop a flight, is that fair?" That question landed in the airplane cabin like a pebble thrown into calm water. It didn't cause a big ripple immediately, but it spread gradually. Avery turned toward the man. She showed no sign of displeasure. She had anticipated this moment. This is the hardest part, not being humiliated, but having your powers scrutinized. "That's a legitimate question," Avery said slowly, "and I think everyone has the right to ask it." The man in the gray suit from the Federal Aviation Safety Liaison looked at Avery, his gaze sharper than before. He didn't intervene. He was observing. The entire cockpit is observing. The man in seat 1A looked up. For the first time, his arrogance was gone. There was only confusion mixed with defensiveness. The man in seat 28 continued. "If anyone else sat in that seat, would the flight be stopped?" The question wasn't malicious, but it was sharp. Avery nodded very slightly. She didn't answer immediately. She thought of the word power. For many years, Avery was not given power. She had to take it line of code decision of decision, every doubt of her. And when she finally had power in her hands, she told herself one thing: never use it to win an argument. She looked around the cabin. If anyone else discovers the same aberration in the system, Avery said, and triggers the correct procedure, the result will still be the same. But they can't activate it, another man interjected. Only she has that authority. Avery nodded. That's right, she admitted. And that's precisely why I have to take on more responsibility. A few murmurs arose. Not outright opposition. Not full support either. Rather consideration. Daniel Reyes looked at Avery with a completely different gaze. It was no longer just respect. It was curiosity about how someone could stand firm when all the arrows were pointing at them. The man in the gray suit took a step forward. "Miss Coleman," he said, "I need to ask directly. Was the decision to trigger the additional security check influenced by the previous seat dispute?" That question was like a thin blade. It's not because it's unfair, it's because it's necessary. Avery took a deep breath. This was the moment when all defenses had to be dropped. There was no avoiding it, no flowery words. "Yes," she said, partially. A very soft murmur escaped. Not anger, but surprise at the frankness. Avery continued before anyone could misunderstand. "That incident made me pay more attention to the system," she said. "It made me stop and examine it more closely. But the final decision wasn't based on emotion." The man in the gray suit didn't interrupt. He nodded, signaling Avery to continue. "If I open the logs and see no discrepancies," Avery said, "the flight has taken off. No exceptions, no retaliation." She looked directly at the man in seat 1A. Not challenging, just a fact laid bare between two people. "I'm not using the system to teach anyone a lesson," Avery said. "I'm using it to do exactly what it was created to do." The airplane cabin fell silent. The man in seat 1 bowed his head. He said nothing. The elderly woman in seat 34C spoke up. Her voice trembled slightly, but was clear. "I don't know much about technology," she said, "but I do know this. If you have the power and you don't use it to protect yourself, that's what I find frightening." A few people nodded. Not all at once, but sincerely. Avery felt a slight lump in her throat. Not because she felt defended, but because the remark struck at her deepest fear. "If I do nothing, what will say about who I am?" The man in the gray suit jotted something down on his device. Then, he looked up. "We will record your decision in the minutes," he said, "and we will evaluate it according to ethical standards and procedure." Avery nodded. "That's the right thing to do," she said. Laura Mitchell stood a few steps away, her hands clasped together. She looked at Avery, then at the man in seat 1A, then at the floor. She realized something she had never considered before. Sometimes fairness doesn't come from avoiding trouble. It comes from accepting it. A young passenger raised his phone, then lowered it again. He hesitated. "I'm sorry," he said to Avery. "I filmed the video, not to humiliate anyone. It's just, I thought people should see this." Avery looked at him. She didn't ask for it to be deleted. "No objection. You have the right," she said. "I just hope you'll tell it truthfully." He nodded. From this moment on, the story spiraled out of Avery's control. It's no longer a story about a technical system or a personal dispute. It becomes a story about how a person uses power when no one forces them to do the right thing. Avery returned to seat 34B and sat down. She felt more tired than before, but also lighter in a way that was hard to describe. She knew that from now on some would call her brave, others would call her dangerous. Neither is entirely correct. Avery was simply a human being who saw something wrong and decided not to turn away. Once the story is no longer confined to the airplane cabin, it begins to distort. It's not because the truth changes, it's because of who tells it. Less than 30 minutes after flight AC 781 went grounded, Avery Coleman's phone rang for the first time since she opened her laptop. Not a call from the technical team, not from the Federal Aviation Safety Liaison. It's from the board of directors of Helix Aero Systems. Avery looked at the caller ID displayed on the screen. Richard Halverson, chairman of the board. A man Avery had worked with for 8 years. Polite, calm, and very good at masking his anxiety behind neutral statements. Avery didn't answer the phone right away. She looked around the airplane cabin. A few passengers had already started posting on social media. Short notes, shaky videos. The headlines were vague, but the direction was clear. Flight grounded after CEO intervention. Black woman CEO halts flight over seat dispute. Avery closed her eyes for a moment. She knew this would happen. But knowing doesn't mean being prepared. The phone vibrated a second time. Avery answered the phone. "Richard," she said, "you called so quickly." Richard's voice rang out still, maintaining its familiar calmness. "Avery, what's going on?" he asked. "The press is calling us. The shareholders are too." Avery didn't beat around the bush. "I triggered the additional verification process because I detected an inappropriate override," she said. "There's a complete log." A brief silence. "I understand," Richard said. "But the problem isn't just technical." Avery's lips curved slightly. She didn't smile. "I know," she replied. "The problem is the story." Richard exhaled. "There are people on the council who are concerned," he said, "that this decision could be interpreted as the use of personal power in a sensitive situation." Avery leaned back in her seat. She looked out the window. The plane remained still, but outside the world was moving at a rapid pace. "What do you think?" Avery asked. Richard was silent for a few seconds longer than usual. "I think," he said slowly, "that we need to temporarily separate Avery Coleman, the CEO, from this story. To protect the company." Avery closed her eyes. This time, she wasn't surprised. "Temporarily?" she asked. "Right," Richard said. "A tactical retreat. Taking a break from operations while the investigation is underway. Just a formality. It's just a formality." Avery opened her eyes. She stared into the space in front of her, where the security screen was still repeatedly showing reassuring images. "And what if I don't agree?" Avery asked. Richard's voice lowered. "Then the council will vote." The words fell softly, but they carried a heavy weight. Avery nodded, though Richard couldn't see it. "I understand," she said. "Give me 10 minutes." She hung up the phone. Inside the cabin, Laura Mitchell was talking to an unpleasant passenger. Daniel Reyes stood at the end of the aisle, a walkie-talkie in hand. Everyone was busy with their own work, unaware that elsewhere a meeting without Avery was forming. Avery opened her phone again. A message from Evan Brooks appeared. The press started asking about her access. There were rumors the council would take action. Avery types quickly. "I guessed it. Keep the log as is. No editing, no reaction," Evan replied. "Understood." Avery put down the phone. She felt a very slight chill run down her spine. Not fear, but a sharp alertness. The system she built to combat wrongdoing is now being used to isolate her. A young man in seat 35 leaned towards Avery. "I'm sorry," he said, lowering his voice. "I just saw on Twitter. They're saying you did that because you were discriminated against." Avery looked at him. She nodded. "Perhaps," she said. "They might also say I did it for power." "But what about the truth?" he asked. Avery thought for a second. "The truth rarely spreads the fastest," she replied. In first class, the man in seat 1A was on the phone. His voice was quieter than before, but urgent. "No, I don't know who she is," he said. "No, I haven't done anything wrong." Avery heard it. She didn't turn around. She no longer cared what that man thought. What concerned her was what would happen next to people like Laura, like Daniel, like Evan, people in the middle of the system, not powerful enough to decide, but close enough to be influenced. The phone vibrated again. An email from the board. The subject line was brief. "Emergency board vote. Temporary executive action." Avery opened the email. The content was cold, perfectly in line with legal jargon. Due to the sensitive nature of the matter, and to ensure objectivity in the evaluation process, the Board of Directors of Helix Aerosystems has decided to temporarily suspend CEO Avery Coleman from his executive duties effective. Immediately, Avery read it all. Not a single word was missed. There was no mention of dismissal. There was no mention of misconduct. "It's only temporary, and protecting company interests." Avery folded her phone shut. She placed it in her cloth bag next to her laptop. She took a deep breath. Very deep breath. Inside the airplane cabin, everything looked the same, but Avery knew a new line had been drawn. Power isn't just about pressing a button. It's about deciding who gets to tell their story and who gets left out. Laura Mitchell approached, speaking softly. "Mrs. Coleman," she said, "the press is outside the gate. They're asking for your name." Avery nodded. "I guess so," she said. "Would you like us to?" Laura hesitated. "No," Avery interrupted, her voice gentle. "Just do your job." Laura nodded. Her eyes filled with complex emotions. She understood that the woman before her had just been thrust into a game where the rules were far from fair. Daniel Reyes arrived next. "They're saying," he said, "that she may have gone too far." Avery looked at him. "What do you think?" she asked. Daniel hesitated. Then he spoke. "I think, if your system isn't strong enough to withstand the right decision, then perhaps the problem isn't with you." Avery smiled very slightly. "Thank you," she said. The plane was still grounded, but for Avery, a greater sense of being grounded was unfolding inside. It wasn't because she was suspended. It was because she was seeing a harsh truth. The system doesn't like people who force it to look in the mirror. And from this moment on, Avery Coleman was no longer protected by the very system she had created. When Avery Coleman closed the phone, no sound came out. No sighs, no trembling hands. No dramatic reaction, unlike what is usually seen when someone has just lost a position they've built up their whole life. There was only a very quiet space. Avery sat still in seat 34, back straight, hands resting on her lap. She gazed straight ahead where the safety screen had long since gone off, leaving a dark glass surface that faintly reflected her own image. No more CEO. No more the ultimate authority. No more that title that made people change their tone when addressing him. Only one middle-aged black woman remained seated on a grounded flight, and strangely enough, Avery didn't feel herself falling apart. She felt naked. It was a very different feeling from failure. Not a sharp pain, not bitterness. Rather, it was like standing in front of a mirror without makeup, without business cards, without the things that had helped her get through the door. Who is Avery Coleman? When he's no longer CEO, that question isn't new. But this time, it's no longer a philosophical assumption. It's a reality. The older woman in seat 34C opened her eyes and looked at Avery. She had been noticing her all along. The way Avery sat, the way she folded her phone, the way she wasn't in a hurry to speak to anyone. "What were they saying, dear?" she asked, her voice soft, not curious. Avery turned. She didn't answer immediately. She considered, not because she didn't know what to say, but because she didn't know how truthful she should be. "They told me I'm temporarily not going to do my job anymore," Avery said. The woman frowned. "Just because of what happened today," Avery nodded. "Because of what happened today, and because of what it revealed." The woman was silent for a long time. Then she sighed. "You know," she said, "people don't usually punish the people who cause the problem. They punish the people who make the problem appear." Avery smiled very faintly. A sad smile, but one that didn't break. "I understand," she replied. In first class, the man in seat 1A was being asked to leave the plane to assist in the investigation. He stood up, adjusted his jacket, but no longer had his initial confidence. As he walked past the economy class, his eyes inadvertently met Avery's. In that moment, Avery saw something very human: confusion. Not regret, not hostility, just the realization that the world didn't revolve on the axis he had believed. He said nothing. Neither did Avery. Not every confrontation needs a resolution. Daniel Reyes approached and bowed slightly. "Mrs. Coleman," he said in a low voice, "they are clearing a path for passengers to disembark while they wait for security checks. You may stay if you wish." Avery nodded. "I'll stay," she said. It wasn't because she had nowhere to go. It was because she wasn't running away from this moment. Laura Mitchell stood at the end of the aisle, helping passengers with their luggage. She glanced at Avery several times, as if wanting to say something, then stopped herself. Avery understood. There are distances that arise not from malice, but from fear. As the cabin emptied, the noise subsided. Only a few passengers remained, those in no hurry. Those who somehow, too, were in their own moment of quiet. Avery leaned back in her chair. She closed her eyes. For the first time since that morning, she allowed herself to let go of the need to maintain her image. She reflected on the path she had taken. On the times she had been asked, "Who gave you the right?" On the times she had to answer with results, not words. She thought back to the day Helix Aero landed its first major contract. The day she signed, her hands trembled with responsibility, not with fear of failure. She thought of her mother, who had once said, "You don't need to be invited to enter the rooms you helped build." And then another thought came, slowly, clearly. If I no longer had a title today, would I still have my principles? Avery opened her eyes. The answer came immediately, without hesitation. Have. The principle doesn't lie in the title. It lies in the decisions we make when the title no longer protects us. The phone vibrated. A message from Evan Brooks. They blocked her access, but the logs are still intact. No one dares to edit them. Avery typed it back in. Thanks, Evan. Stay strong. No matter what, Evan replied after a few seconds. We will not let the truth disappear. Avery put down the phone. A real weariness washed over her. Not weariness from the struggle, but weariness from understanding the price of not remaining silent. A security guard approached. Madam, he said politely, we will need your signature for one more confirmation. Avery signed it. She didn't read every line carefully. Not because she was careless, but because she knew that the content was no longer what determined the story's fate. What matters is how it's told. When the formalities were temporarily completed, Avery stood up. The aisle was now empty. The lights in the compartment were dimmer. She stood there for a while, not in a hurry to leave, not for regretting, but for remembering. Remember the feeling when all the layers of protection are removed. When power departs, when only people are left with their choices. Avery stepped off the plane. There were no flashing cameras, no shouting crowds, just a long corridor, white lights, and the distinct sound of footsteps. With each step, Avery felt lighter even though outside the world was preparing to place a new burden upon her. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring. She didn't know what the council would decide. She didn't know what headlines the press would choose. But there's one thing Avery knows very well. When all titles are taken away, what remains is the true self. And that man, Avery Coleman, has no regrets. Avery Coleman stepped out of the gate area on a pale, gray afternoon. The fluorescent lights in the airport corridor reflected off the polished stone floor, casting long, thin, cold shadows. She gently adjusted the strap of her canvas bag over her shoulder. The laptop was still there, so was her phone. But the outside world had begun to move in a way Avery could no longer control. At the end of the hallway, a few reporters stood scattered. Not many, not noisy. They weren't sure what they were waiting for. They only knew that there was a story. Mrs. Coleman, a voice called out. Avery stopped, not because she was forced to, but because she chose to stop. She turned around. No adjustment of her hair, no change in expression, just standing straight as she always did in the most difficult meeting rooms. I'll only answer one question, Avery said. Nothing more. A female reporter stepped forward, microphone in hand. Did she use her personal power to stop the flight because of perceived discrimination? The question was sharp, but not malicious. Avery understood that. Avery didn't answer immediately. She looked straight into the camera. No challenge. No plea. I did what the system told me to do, she said. After I discovered a discrepancy, everything else is speculation. Do you regret it? Another voice asked. Avery shook her head. No, she replied, but I understand why some people might be upset. She said nothing more. She turned and walked away. There were no shouts of pursuit, no barrage of questions, just the rapid clicking of keyboards and eyes following her retreating figure. Avery left the airport through a side exit. There was no company shuttle, no assistant. She hailed a taxi. The driver was a middle-aged, dark-skinned man with a southern accent. Where are you going? He asked. Downtown, Avery replied. The car started moving. The radio was on low. The afternoon news played, interspersed with commercials. A flight in Atlanta was grounded after the safety system requested additional checks. Sources indicate the CEO of the technology company behind the system was on board. The driver glanced in the rearview mirror. That sounds familiar, he said. That's a hot topic right now. Avery did not answer. After a moment, the driver continued, his voice slow and deliberate. You know, he said, I have a daughter. She often tells me that sometimes doing the right thing makes people hate you. I always tell her, it's better to be hated than to live knowing you've remained silent. Avery smiled very slightly. He raised his children very well, she said. The taxi turned onto a busy street. Neon lights began to come on. The city resumed its rhythm of life as if nothing had just happened. But the story is spreading online, not in a single direction. A video was posted on Twitter. It shows Avery standing in the economy class aisle, speaking calmly surrounded by curious stares. The text scrolls below Black woman CEO stopped a flight not out of anger, but out of principle. Another article appeared on a technology blog. It's not about the seats. This is a story about a system being bent for convenience. Conflicting opinions began to erupt. She abused her power. No, she did the right thing. If it were someone else, would this have happened? Avery didn't read it right away. She knew that if she read it too soon, her emotions would overwhelm the calm she was trying to maintain. She arrived at a small apartment in downtown Atlanta. Not luxurious, no great views, but quiet. This is where Avery stays when she doesn't want to be in those representative spaces. She put her bag down, take off her coat, make a cup of hot tea. Her hands trembled slightly this time from exhaustion. Avery sat down on the sofa. She allowed herself to breathe. The phone vibrated. A message from Evan Brooks. "Did you see that?" Avery replied. "Not yet." Evan typed it back right away. "The engineering community is speaking out. Not because of her. Because of the system." Avery closed her eyes. She felt something loosen in her chest. "Thank you, Evan," she texted. "That's important." Another message arrived. From an unknown number. "She doesn't know who I am. But I was once forced off a flight because of a misunderstanding. Today I see myself in her." Avery read slowly. Then she put the phone down. This is something she had never dared to hope for. Not an exoneration. Not praise. It's a resonance. Avery turned on the TV. A major news channel was reporting on the incident. The footage was edited. Some details were blurred, but the commentator's voice wasn't entirely critical. What caught many people's attention was Avery Coleman's reaction. No shouting, no confrontation, just a series of decisions based on process. An expert was invited to speak. "The issue here," he said, "is not about power. It's about the question: if the most powerful person doesn't dare to do the right thing for fear of being misunderstood, then what is the point of that system?" Avery turned off the TV. She didn't need to hear any more. The phone rang again. An email from Richard Halverson. Briefly, carefully. "Avery, public opinion is shifting. We need to talk." Avery read it. She didn't reply immediately. She got up and went out onto the small balcony. A gentle afternoon breeze was blowing. The city below was noisy and vibrant. Avery placed her hand on the railing. She thought of the plane, of the economy class, of the gaze of the older woman, of the moral question that had been thrown back at her. And now the story has found its own voice. It no longer belongs to Avery. It no longer belongs to Helix Arrow. Instead, it belongs to those who were once told to keep quiet to avoid trouble. Avery knew the road ahead was still long. The council was still there. Power remained suspended. Negative articles would continue to appear. But for the first time since stepping off the plane, Avery didn't feel alone. Light doesn't come like a miracle. It comes slowly, scattered, through very faint voices, and sometimes that's enough to keep going. The next morning arrived slowly, as if the city of Atlanta itself was hesitating. Avery Coleman woke up before his alarm clock. Not out of anxiety, but because of an old habit, a habit of someone accustomed to taking responsibility before the world even asks a question. She made coffee. The aroma of hot coffee filled the small apartment, bringing Avery back to the present. She didn't open the news right away. She didn't check social media. She knew that today the most important thing wasn't the comments. It's in the data. The phone vibrated. A message from Evan Brooks arrived earlier than usual. "We have what you need." Avery closed her eyes for a moment. She typed again. "Call me." The call connected almost instantly. Evan's voice was low, but betrayed his intense concentration. "Last night, Evan said we reviewed all overrides from the last 6 months. Not just AC 781. Avery set her coffee cup down. She sat up straight, and she asked. "There's a pattern," Evan replied. "Overrides prioritizing manual operations appear much more frequently on flights with VIP passengers, major business partners, or when there are complaints from first class." Avery said nothing. She let Evan continue. "What's noteworthy," Evan said, "is that these overrides were often approved quickly with almost no cross-checking required, and in 3 cases, the system issued a warning. But it was ignored." Avery took a deep breath. "Is anyone else listed as the owner?" she asked. "Not directly," Evan said. But there's a coordination team that does it regularly. And there's internal email. What email? Avery asked. Evan hesitated for a second, a rare occurrence for him. The email used the phrase, "keep things moving," he said. "Keep things running smoothly." Avery closed her eyes. That phrase echoed familiarly, chillingly. It had appeared in countless meetings, in countless decisions made for the common good. "Send it to me," Avery said. "In its original condition." "We did," Evan replied. "And there's one more thing." Avery waited. "There are two dispatchers willing to testify," Evan said. "They said they're tired of having to choose between process and underhanded pressure." Avery opened her eyes. This time she felt not only relief, she felt confirmation. "Arrange a meeting," she said. "No recording, no notice. Just listen." Evan agreed. Avery hung up the phone. She sat still for a long time, letting the truth sink in. Not the truth about a flight, but about a culture that had formed in the shadows. The phone vibrated again. An email from Richard Halverson. "We're meeting at 11 o'clock. The council wants to hear an explanation." Avery finished reading. She didn't reply immediately. She knew that today, if she were to speak, she wouldn't speak with emotion. She would speak with something that the system would find hardest to deny. Data. The meeting took place via video, 12 squares on the screen, 12 familiar faces. Polite, calm, and wary. Richard spoke first. "Avery," he said, "before we go any further, I need your confirmation. Do you have a copy of the system logs?" Avery looked directly into the camera. "No," she said, "but Helix Aero does." Another council member intervened. "Do you know how much damage triggering the second-level inspection has caused?" Avery nodded. "I know," she said. "And I also know that ignoring the warning could cause even greater damage." A moment of silence. Avery continued. "Before you question my motives," she said, "I want us to look at the data." She shared a screenshot. No fancy charts. No dramatic colors. Just logs, timelines, and system notes. In 6 months, Avery said there were 17 overrides of manual priorities out of context. 3 times, the warning system was ignored. One council member frowned. "And how does that relate to what happened yesterday?" "It's directly related," Avery replied. AC 781 was the first time the process wasn't ignored. Richard looked closely at the screen. "Because she was there," he said. Avery nodded. "That's right," she said. "And that's the problem. Some faces changed expression, not because of the accusations, but because of the mirror. If a process is only respected when the head of the system happens to be present," Avery continued, "then that process doesn't really exist." Another member spoke up. "Are you saying that we tolerated it?" Avery did not use the word tolerance. "I'm saying," she said, "that we've prioritized convenience over consistency." The meeting lost its initial pace. Questions became slower, more cautious. Richard cleared his throat. "Avery," he said, "we need independent verification." "Of course," Avery replied. "And I propose opening all logs to the Federal Aviation Safety Liaison." A few eyes widened. "Do you understand what that means?" someone asked. Avery nodded. "I understand," she said. "It means there's no longer room for a one-sided story." The meeting ended without a final decision, but Avery knew the balance had begun to shift. That afternoon, Avery met with 2 dispatchers at a small cafe far from the city center. They preferred to remain anonymous. They just wanted to hear from him. The first person spoke very softly. "We were praised for solving things quickly," he said. "Nobody said we did anything wrong. It's just everyone knows what's expected." The second person continued. "There are times when I see the warning light up," she said, "and tell myself it'll probably be okay." This time was no different. Avery listened. No notes, no interrupting. "Do you know why the system was created?" Avery asked. They shook their heads. "So that no one has to tell themselves, it'll probably be okay," Avery said. "Not because you're incompetent, but because the pressure can make even the most capable people make mistakes." They both fell silent. Then they nodded. In the evening, the news changed its tone. New data reveals inappropriate override patterns on many flights. Internal witnesses confirm pressure to prioritize convenience. The story is no longer about Avery. It's about a system vulnerability. Avery's phone vibrated. A message from Richard. "The council will review the decision. We need to talk in person." Avery looked at the screen. She didn't see victory. She saw a greater sense of responsibility. She answered briefly. I'm ready. Avery got up and opened the window. The night breeze was cooler. The city was still brightly lit. The distant sounds of car horns mingled with the wind. The truth has spoken. Not loudly, not noisily. But it was clear enough to force the system to stop and listen. The in-person meeting with the Helix Aero Board of Directors took place on Tuesday morning following the incident. No large conference room. No newspapers. No screens crammed with charts. Just a glass-enclosed room overlooking the Atlanta streets bathed in natural light enough to clearly see every face. Avery Coleman arrived early. She chose a seat at the head of the table, not for power she no longer had, that power but out of a habit of taking responsibility. Richard Halverson entered last. He paused briefly when he saw Avery, then nodded in greeting. No unnecessary formality. No avoidance. Thank you all for coming, Richard began once everyone was seated. Today, we're not meeting to argue about right and wrong. We're meeting to decide what needs to change. No one objected. No one nodded too quickly. One council member, Mary Ann Lowell, spoke up. She was one of the few in the room who had supported Avery from the beginning. We've seen the entire log, Mary Ann said. Not just AC 781. All of it. Avery remained silent. She didn't need to repeat what she had already presented. The data did the work for her. The problem, Mary Ann continued, is not with an individual. It's with the fact that we have allowed exceptions to become the norm. Another member, Thomas Reed, leaned forward. What does that mean in terms of action? He asked. Richard looked at Avery. That means, he said, slowly we need to fix how the system responds to human pressure and fix how we respond to the system. Richard Quay, saying Avery. Avery, he said, you have put us in a difficult position, but it is also a necessary one. Avery nodded, not defending himself, not taking credit. I wasn't seeking that situation, she said. I just didn't avoid it. A moment of silence passed. Not heavy, but mature. Richard continued. The council voted this morning, he said. Her temporary suspension will be lifted, effective immediately. Avery didn't react immediately. No smile, no sigh of relief. She just looked down at the glass tabletop where the light reflected off sharp lines. But Richard continued, that comes with another condition. Avery looked up. We want you to lead a quiet rewriting, Richard said. No press releases, no slogans. A change from within, Mary Ann added. Specifically, she said, completely eliminate manual priority overrides in non-emergency situations. Any exceptions must have 2 independent layers of authentication. Avery listened. She had been thinking about this for a long time. But when she heard it being said by the council, she understood this would affect the interests of many people. Thomas Reed frowned. That would slow things down, he said. The partners wouldn't be happy. Avery looked at him. Safety isn't measured by the level of satisfaction, she said. It's measured by the number of times we don't have to apologize afterward. No one laughed. But no one objected either. Richard took a deep breath. And one more thing, he said. We want you to consider, would you like to return to the CEO position? Right now, the question hung in the air. Not dramatic, but heavy. Avery didn't answer immediately. She thought about the past few days, about the economy class, about the feeling of being stripped of her title, about the gaze of the older woman, about the messages from strangers. She thought about returning power, responsibility, pressure all coming back at once. And she considered another possibility. I want to go back, Avery said slowly, but not in the old way. Richard frowned slightly. What do you mean? He asked. I want a transition period, Avery said. A temporary role focused on restructuring the system and operational culture. Then, I will step down from the CEO position. The whole room fell silent. Mary Ann's eyes widened. Avery, she said. You don't have to. Avery raised his hand, slightly signaling to stop. I know I don't need it, she said. But I choose to. Richard leaned back in his chair. She just set a precedent, he said. A CEO voluntarily stepping down after forcing the system to fix itself. Avery smiled very slightly. Perhaps it's time for that precedent to exist. The meeting ended not with a victory handshake, but with a silent consensus. That afternoon, Avery returned to the Helix Aero office for the first time since his suspension. There was no boisterous welcome, no applause, only nods, and the gazes were more direct than before. Evan Brooks greeted Avery at the door. She's back, he said. For now, Avery replied. And, with a long list, Evan smiled. For the first time in days, we are ready. Avery walked past the rows of desks. He heard the clicking of keyboards, the hushed conversations. The atmosphere was serious, but not tense. She paused at the large whiteboard in the technical meeting room. She picked up a pen. "We'll start here," Avery said. "No patching. Rewrite." The following days flew by. No speeches, no interviews, just long meetings, deleted lines of code and procedures rewritten in clearer language. Overrides are locked. Warnings take precedence. And most important, every decision leaves an indelible mark. One evening, Avery sat alone in her office. The city lights outside the window twinkled. She looked around the room that had once been the center of her power. She has no regrets. She felt it was complete. The phone vibrated. A message from Richard. The media asked why she didn't take advantage of this opportunity to consolidate her position. Avery replied, "Because status is not a legacy." She turned off the lights, left the office. Outside, the world remains noisy. But inside Helix Aero, a change has taken place, no with applause, but with decisions that are difficult to reverse. Avery Coleman stepped out into the Atlanta night. The wind was cool. His steps were steady. She knew that the end of the story didn't depend on whether she kept her seat or left it. The problem is that once she left, the system was no longer the same. 6 months after Flight AC-781, no one mentioned it as an incident anymore. People call it by other names. A turning point. A precedent. The moment the system had to stop and look at itself. But for Avery Coleman, it was just another ordinary day in the life of a man who chose not to turn away. That morning, Avery stood in a small room at Helix Aerosystems headquarters. Not a boardroom, not the CEO's office. Instead, it was an internal training room where young, newly hired engineers sat in a circle. No podium, no microphone, no slides. Avery leaned against the table, holding a cup of cold coffee. "Before we talk about the system," she said, "I want to talk about the people." The room was silent, not because of tension, but because of listening. "You'll be taught that procedures exist to protect safety," Avery continued. "But there will come a time when pressure makes you want to bend it, just a little." A few people nodded very slightly. No one smiled. At that time, Avery said, "Don't ask, can I do it? Ask if everyone did the same as me, what would the system become?" No one took notes. But Avery knew that such statements didn't need to be recorded. After the training session, Avery left the Helix Aero building with a small cardboard box. Not much. A few books, an old picture frame, a metal pen that had been with her for over 10 years. Evan Brooks stood at the door. "So, today," he said. Avery nodded. "Today," she replied. "Are you sure?" Evan asked. "You can stay. The council wants you to." Avery looked at him and smiled. "Evan," she said, "a good system shouldn't depend on one person." Evan swallowed hard. He nodded. "We will keep it exactly as she wrote it." Avery put the cardboard box down and hugged Evan quickly. "No formality. No ceremony. Don't keep it from me," she said. "Keep it for the people who will never be in this room to defend themselves." Avery left Helix Aero on a sunny afternoon. No reporters, no announcements. Just a woman stepping out of the place she had built with a rare sense of wholeness. A few weeks later, Avery was on a different flight. No first-class cabin. No seat 1A. It's just seat 22C by the window. The person sitting next to her was a young, dark-skinned woman who was fumbling to put away her handbag. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm a little nervous about flying." Avery smiled. "I used to be like that too," she replied. When the plane took off, there were no incidents. No warnings. No one was asked to stand up. Everything went smoothly. Avery looked out the window. The city below shrank, the streets becoming thin threads. She thought of the question that had haunted her. Who am I when I no longer have a name? Now the answer is very clear. She was the one who saw the wrong and chose not to remain silent. A few months later, Avery appeared at a small workshop on technology ethics. No keynote. No big stage, just a talk. A student asked her, "What frightened you the most that day?" Avery thought for a moment. "It's not about losing my position," she said. "It's about the possibility of getting used to being silent." The room was completely silent. Another person asked, "If you could go back, would you do things differently?" Avery shook her head. "I just wish," she said, "that there didn't have to be a grounded flight for people to believe that the system can go wrong." After the workshop, an elderly woman approached. She held Avery's hand very tightly. "I used to be a flight attendant," she said. 30 years. I've seen things that are overlooked. Thank you for not calling it a small matter." Avery squeezed her hand. "Thank you for being there." The story of Flight AC 781 gradually faded from the headlines. But it didn't disappear. It became an example in training courses, a case study in the curriculum, a story retold in the kitchen, in the break room, in very casual conversations. And somewhere there are people who have never known Avery standing at a small crossroads and remembering that there was someone who never crossed that line. One late afternoon, Avery sat in her old apartment, sunlight streaming through the window. She opened the picture frame that had been in the cardboard box for so long. Inside was a photograph of Avery when she was very young, standing next to her mother. They were smiling. No power, no title. It's simply a matter of belief that doing the right thing always matters, even when no one applauds. The phone vibrated. A message from an unknown number. "My daughter just got a promotion today. She told me I won't stay silent. I think you should know." Avery read. Her eyes welled up slightly. She put the phone down. She looked outside. No need to reply. There are some things that once they've spread don't need a response. This story doesn't end with a victory. There are no winners or losers. It ended with something even rarer: healing. Heal those who were once considered annoying. Heal those who were once silent out of fear. And heal the system itself when it is forced to remember why it exists. Avery Coleman stood up and opened the window. The wind rushed in, carrying the sounds of traffic, people, and life itself. She's no longer the CEO. She's no longer the center of attention. But somewhere on some flight, a seat was returned to its rightful place. And sometimes, that's all it takes for the world to move forward a little. The story of Avery Coleman is not the story of a plain seat. It is the story of small moments that carry immense weight in each person's life. In life, especially as we go through many years, everyone has at some point chosen silence to maintain peace. Silence to ensure things go smoothly. Silence to avoid trouble. Silence because they think, "Let's just let it go." But this story reminds us of something very important: not all silence is harmless. When a system, whether a company, society, or family, only functions smoothly when the weaker party suffers, that is not stability, but a hidden imbalance. Avery didn't yell. She didn't retaliate. She didn't use her power to prove she was right. She did one very difficult thing: she stood by her principles, even at the cost of it. And the most beautiful thing is, she didn't win by humiliating others, but by forcing the entire system to reflect on itself. No matter what age we are, we still have the right to choose. Choose silence for an easier life, or choose to be kind to our own conscience. Sometimes just one person, not turning away, can change the world a little. Thank you for staying until the very end of this story. If this story resonated with you even just a little, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel so we can continue telling more authentic, insightful, and humane stories like this. Your companionship is what keeps these stories of kindness being told.